Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played between Rudolf Spielmann and Savielly Tartakower. This was played in the 1909 Muenchen Munich tournament in Munich, Germany, and without further ado, let's look at this game. Spielmann on the white end starts by playing the move e4, and we have c6 by Tartakower, the Caro-Kann defense. d4, d5, and now knight c3. So, the main variation of the Caro-Kann. And now after d takes e4, knight takes e4, the move knight to f6. A very common idea where you just simply develop your knight out and you want to trade the knights on the f6 square, where you're either going to recapture with the e-pawn or with the g-pawn, assuming that white does actually capture the knight. Instead of capturing the knight, however, Spielmann decides to play the move knight g3. He ignores the knight, and he plans to just continue development normally. e5 is played by Tartakower, and back then, this was actually how it used to be played. Nowadays, you're usually going to see moves like c5 being played, maybe knight to d7, before playing the move e5. But back then, e5 directly was the way to go. So e5 by Tartakower, and now knight to f3. So Spielmann attacks the pawn on e5 and is now threatening to take it. E takes d4, knight takes d4, and now bishop to c5, attacking the knight on d4. But this is also giving Spielmann a choice, whether he wants to move the knight back, or whether he should defend it with either this knight or with the bishop. So let's see what happens if Spielmann were to move the knight back. So if Spielmann were to move this knight to f3, or anywhere on the board, what would you play here if you were Tartakower? Okay, so in this specific case, Tartakower would have played bishop takes f2 check, and the problem that Spielmann faces is that he can't take the bishop just like that, since his queen is unguarded. So he would have to play the move king to e2. But this just simply runs into the problem of all the pieces getting traded off. So queen takes d1, king takes d1, bishop takes g3, h takes g3, and then after knight to e4, it's simply a win for Tartakower because you're either going to lose the g3 pawn or you're going to blunder everything away from a fork. And basically, there's no way to defend both of these two squares, and after this, Tartakower is just going to win the game. So Spielmann cannot play the knight back to f3, and it's the same if the knight moves anywhere else, whether it be to f5, b3, or even e2. So you must defend the knight on d4, and that is what Spielmann does. He plays bishop to e3. And here, Tartakower plays queen to b6, and this makes sense, given that he wants to, of course, attack Spielmann. And with queen to b6, Tartakower is preparing to capture the pawn on b2, or to later on build up pressure against the knight on d4, and then eventually capture it if there is any chance that you can. So queen to e2 is now played by Spielmann, and Spielmann wants to get a discovery with his bishop and get a discovered check towards the black king. So Tartakower castles, and now queenside castle by Spielmann. And Spielmann isn't really worried about the attack that Tartakower has on the queen side, because there really is not a way to enhance it any further. And that too, only two pieces are really in the position that are trying to attack the white king, and that's just the queen and the bishop. And potentially the knight, yes, but for the moment there doesn't really seem to be any severe attack that's going on the queen side. So knight to d5. Tartakower brings in another piece to try helping the attack. Queen to h5 now by Spielmann. And Spielmann's plan is more on the side of trying to bring this bishop out to d3 and attack that way. This is one method. Another method could always be to bring one of these knights into the f5 square, and from there are obviously lots of potential threats that Spielmann has. So in this case, knight to f6 was played by Tartakower. He attacks the queen, and he also tries to reinforce the h7 pawn, as it was a potential target, and now queen to h4. Sidestepping the attack on the queen, and now bishop to g4 is played by Tartakower. Why does Tartakower play bishop to g4 and not play something else that could maybe defend his king a bit more? Well, because there really isn't anything to play. Since going g6 to try blocking out the bishop from ever using this diagonal, this b1h7 diagonal, would just lose you the knight on f6. You can't go anywhere that actually tries to reinforce the h7 pawn, while at the same time not going to get your material loss. So bishop to g4, and what Tartakower wants to do is create a counter attack on the rook, and then perhaps go h5 if this rook ever moves, and basically when the pawn is on h5, it's nicely solidified by the bishop on g4. So after bishop to g4, you'd expect that Spielmann would of course move the rook maybe to d3 to get an attack. However, that's not what Spielmann does, and in fact he actually goes bishop to d3. And he is not really concerned about the fact that he might be down material, because he's focusing on something more important, the black king. So after bishop to d3, there is an exchange sacrifice by Spielmann, and after rook takes d1, he actually has a pretty decent position for the exchange. Now, of course, you might have a different opinion on this, but from the perspective that you have to look at is, are Spielmann's pieces nicely active? And the answer to that question is yes. Because although Tartakower is up material, that's true, how exactly can he activate his pieces? This knight on b8 is blocking the development of the rook on a8. And okay, yes, it gets developed on the next move. But all of Spielmann's pieces are already developed, and they're already into the game. So this is the head start that Spielmann is getting, that Tartakower needs time to catch up to. So after knight bd7, knight gf5. Now, obviously, there are threats towards the pawn on g7, assuming it's not defended. And also, you bring in another piece to the attack. So a plan that Spielmann could use to follow suit is probably g4 and then g5, kick the knight away, and then always h7 is an extremely weak point. So knight to e5. This tries to prevent the idea of g4, because now obviously there are two knights controlling that square, but this does not bother Spielmann one bit. He in fact plays knight takes g7. And he is not afraid of the simple king takes g7 or even a move like knight takes d3 check. And this is because if the king were to capture the knight, then there are actually two ways to continue. You could go bishop to h6, which simply checks the king, forces it to go back, and then you capture the knight. Or you could just simply play queen to h6 check. And after king to g8, same idea, queen takes f6. And this position is already winning for Spielmann. So taking the knight isn't a good idea, and capturing the bishop on d3 isn't a good one either, because after rook takes d3, king takes g7, you could check on g5, you could check on h6. Really a ton of moves to choose from, but in either case, Tartakower isn't going to have the most pleasant of positions. So, after knight g7, Tartakower was forced to be a little bit more passive, so he played queen to d8. Now he's reinforcing the knight on f6, but now Spielmann just plays knight gf5. And Spielmann just simply shredded open the king's side, and now Tartakower is in severe trouble. Knight to g6, attacking the queen. The queen goes to h6, and there is obviously a threat of checkmate on g7, so the knight has to guard that square. Now, the other knight comes over to f3, and what is the plan with this knight f3 move? Well, it's actually to bring this knight over to g5 and then attack the h7 pawn. And basically, it's trying to overload this knight on e8, because the only real way to defend the h7 pawn is to play knight to f6. However, you then blunder the g7 square for checkmate. So bishop takes e3 check, f takes e3, queen f6, and here the move knight g5 was played. And Spielmann is completely on the offensive. He's threatening the h7 pawn. And what did Tartakower play in this position? The best move was actually just to take the knight on g5. But we can obviously see that that's not really going to help you in any case. So what Tartakower did was go queen to h8. And in this position, it obviously seems like there's nothing for Rudolf Spielmann to do. I mean, of course, this knight is nicely cementing the position together. There is absolutely no way that you could actually break through here. And with given time, maybe Tartakower can start to redevelop his pieces, and maybe Spielmann is the one who's eventually going to lose. However, the move that Spielmann played is the reason why I really enjoyed this game, and I find it very, very interesting. So, what was Rudolf Spielmann's 22nd move that, after this was played, Savielly Tartakower resigned the game? Okay, so Spielmann played the move knight to e7, check. And unfortunately for Tartakower, there is only one way to capture the knight, and that is with your own knight. However, this gives up the defense of the b1 h7 diagonal, meaning that this bishop now has access to that diagonal, so Spielmann can take on h7. And with the bishop, not with the queen, because then it'll only lead to a better position for Tartakower. So after bishop takes h7 check, there is no other move but to capture the bishop with your queen, and now queen takes h7, and this is a simple checkmate. So, was there really anything to do, and were there any ways to prevent the ideas that were going to unfold? Not exactly, because this position already illustrates a completely dominating setup that Spielmann has against Tartakower. And unfortunately for Tartakower, he has absolutely no way of defending the position. And especially when this exchange sacrifice happened on move 13, after only a simple 9 more moves, Tartakower simply got crushed by the great Rudolf Spielmann. Like this. So, that was the game. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.